Thank you very much, Juan, for the introduction. And I'll give you also a little bit of more general overview, and then I'll get to the point, as Juan mentioned. So if we can go directly to the next slide. I don't think I need to present more of myself. Some of you have also seen me working as part of the emergency task force. So what is the emergency task force? Just to start with, it's a group of experts from the regulatory network in Europe, which have been working on declared emergencies since 2009, supported the activity of the EMA during the influenza pandemic, H1N1 influenza pandemic, and then after that, worked on Zika and Ebola response from the agency. After 2022, a new regulation in March 2022, a new regulation was implemented and extending the EMA mandate. And within this context, among other legal provisions, the emergency task force now has received a formal legal mandate and is an advisory and support body for public health emergencies, but also for preparedness. So we have a defined list of members, rules of procedure, and a work plan, which you can find in the link provided in a slide, and is co-chaired by an EMA representative, which is Marco Cavaleri, and the vice chair of the CHMP, could be also the chair, of course, in this case is Bruno Sepodes. The composition of the group is based on expertise, depending on the type and level of activities. So, for example, it could be a larger group during a pandemic, like it was during COVID, but now in preparedness, it can be a little bit smaller so that people can also readjust their own agendas. There are experts coming from all of the different entities that you see here in these boxes, from the EMA scientific committees, couple of EMA representatives such as myself, but also assessors coming from the working parties with expertise in vaccinology, infectious disease treatment, biostatistics, clinical trials, inspections, and scientific advice. We have representative from patients and healthcare professionals working party, which is very important to provide a view of these communities, and clinical trial experts from the various member states. And we chose representative from the Clinical Trial Advisory Group, the CTAG, and the Clinical Trials Coordination Group, the CTCG. We can also nominate additional experts on an ad hoc basis, observers from academia, other international regulatory bodies, but they will not be members, but they will contribute technically to the activities of the group. Now you can see the representation in the square is based on the legislation, but we need to choose people which have specific expertise. And if we go to the next slide, I just want to show you what the ETF does in concrete. The group is providing scientific advice to developers on medicines which are targeting a declared or a potential emergency. It's facilitating the conduct of clinical trials in the EU, especially when it's a matter of facilitating larger trials conduct and platform trial, by providing sponsor with a review of the protocol, but also supporting interaction with the experts at the level of the member state for accelerating the trial approval, reviewing available evidence as it is generated, especially important during declared emergency, where there is also the need to publish rapidly recommendations, often in conjunction with the ECDC, so that the views of the two agencies are published together, which are important to facilitate the policy decision of the member state, or other activities such as purchase of medicine from DG ERA, for example. But also ETF can always publish some scientific position statement as they see fit, depending on the needs from a public health perspective. There is also a lot of work in terms of supporting the committees, the European Commission and the member states, in defining what they use, the context of use of imported medicines or unauthorized medicines for an emergency use authorization at the national level, or for national exemption, depending on the need. This is especially important during a declared emergency, but it could also be important in preparedness when there are outbreaks that needs to be tackled to avoid actually a future emergency. And finally, there is a lot of interaction with EU bodies, international bodies, especially HERA, for listing medicines for potential emergency, for example, ECDC, WHO, and international regulators. So with the view to support activities on advanced purchase agreements, but also funding research and more activities on clinical trial, which I'll tell you later. Outside of declared emergency, the activities are the same as during a declared emergency, but the focus is on a series of pathogens which have a pandemic potential. For example, Zika, pandemic influenza or Ebola, and other threats, chemical, radiological, or nuclear origin. These threats are listed in Annex 1 of the ATF work plan. If you are curious, yeah, you have the link. And the ATF focus only on these aspects to support the activities of the committees or EU bodies. And if we go to the next slide, I want to focus a little bit your attention on two activities of the ATF, which are important for clinical trial improving research in Europe. One is the scientific advice procedure, which is also described in the legislation in Article 16. Key to this procedure for the ATF is the collaboration with the expert on clinical trials from the member state, which are sitting in the clinical trials coordination group, the CTCG, because with their contribution, especially because they will be assessing the clinical trial application in their member state, which remain under member state remit, we can tackle bottlenecks. So this is not pre-assessing of what the member state will do, but looking at the scientific advice and having discussed together with clinical CTCG expert, but also ethics committee representative through them, we can tackle in advance potential bottlenecks. We can harmonize views across the various entities, and the final aim is to facilitate clinical trial application and authorization in Europe. This is something that the emergency task force is piloting, but there are discussions also for the standard scientific advice that goes through the SAWP, the Scientific Advice Working Party. And if we go to the next slide, another important activity that to facilitate clinical trial, which is also a legal requirement, is to support the conduct of trials in Europe during public health emergencies, but also during preparedness. And this is Article 15 of the new regulation on the EMA extended mandate. The ATF is supposed to provide scientific support to facilitate trials by advising sponsors of similar trials or linked trials on the establishment of joint trials, on advising on establishing agreement to act as co-sponsor. So what is the overall objective of this, the spirit of the legislation of this article and Article 16 for the scientific advice is that the EMA now has a stronger role in the body of the ATF to support the conduct of coordinated, well-designed, and adequately powered randomized controlled clinical trials in Europe, so that the committees, the European Commission, have robust data and member states to make policy and regulatory decision in an adequate manner. And how the ATF is doing this, and I'll show you in the next slide. For example, this is one case that I have in the next slide concerning monkeypox. So when monkeypox outbreak started during COVID, an academic study started on tecovirimat to test it against monkeypox, and they contacted the ATF co-chair for a rapid advice and support, because they were trying to work across several member states plus the UK, and they wanted to have the same protocol. They were trying to implement the new clinical trial regulation, and they needed help in defining whether it was an interventional study or an observational study, how to harmonize the protocol, how do we harmonize the approval in a centralized and accelerated way, how can we get help on CTIS application, which is the new clinical trial database for trials in the EU. So all of these questions, alongside with can we have your scientific review on the protocol ASAP, came on the ETF table, and in the ETF used this as a first case really to implement the regulation with involving the various stakeholders here and the Commission in the discussion, but also the clinical trial authorities where the study was planned to be conducted at the same table within the ETF to facilitate also a clinical trial coordination group taking action and starting up their own meetings to reach EU-level consensus. Of course, now, having reached a step back, we see that there is a lot of work to improve the process, a lot of work on coordination, improving timelines, because it seems that national approval sometimes is even faster than the centralized one. So, and the role of the different players here. So if we go to the next slide, there is a lot of lesson learned that is happening right now. And for example, the ETF has now established a way to liaise with sponsor and investigator networks who might conduct research to address public health emergencies or potential emergencies. So we have set up a functional mailbox for any sponsor to get in touch with us. We have information published on our website to clarify this role. As I said, we have 4 permanent members from CTCG and CTAG, which have clinical trial expertise. We are involving them systematically in scientific advice assessment, where there is a defined member state where the clinical trial will be conducted. But the vision for the future is for the ETF to work as a coordinator platform involving CTCG, all members possibly, plus representative from ethics committee, provide comments on protocol, even on an informal way via TC, or very rapidly to facilitate approval by the national authorities, coordinate and support interaction across all the entities even better. And ultimately, the goal is to merge smaller trials and protocols and application into larger investigational research, so that data are much more robust and able to support decision. And finally, also support sponsors in filing through CTIS. This activity is not only extremely important in declared emergency during COVID, during monkeypox, but preparedness for future emergency remain key, because we will never be ready unless we work in preparedness. So in this context, if we go to the next slide, EMA, together with the European Commission, held a workshop in June this year to gather all stakeholders around the same table and have a lesson learned discussion on clinical trials in public health emergency. This was chaired by the Director General of Santé for Health and Food Safety, Sandra Gallina, and EMA and various other experts and colleagues from the European Commission, HERA, and others who were sitting at the same table. The scope of the workshop was to review the process for clinical trial during emergency, explore actions that can improve the approval of clinical trials and the conduct multinational trial, and how to define a framework for more integration for clinical trial during any preparation, so to foster larger multinational clinical trial, which is it's a key scope where a lot of efforts are being put right now, because one of the key lessons learned from COVID was the fragmentation of trials and studies in the European Union, which needs to be avoided. Academic sponsors of trials, ethics committee representative, national competent authorities, in addition to EMA, the Commission, were sitting in June at the EMA in Amsterdam. There is now a report being published out of the workshop, which identified a concrete roadmap to tackle the bottlenecks that have been identified, and to launch also some ideas, for example, creating a coordination committee on the central level, and concrete ideas for sustainability of this network. This is the outcome of a technical workshop. So it's like recommendation of all the stakeholders, and there will be then this will be taken up by various entities in different ways, and I'll tell you a little bit more in the next slide. But I just wanted to give you a flavor from the report if we go to the next slide, on what was achieved at the workshop. So first of all, there were problems identified and solution discussed and proposed to the European Commission. For example, insufficient coordination within the member state between the national competent authority and the Commission. In addition to that, across member state as well, for example, different legal requirements. Sorry, there are a few typos here. So this definitely we need to improve the cooperation mechanism. We need to find a way to do that. But then there are other aspects such as slow clinical trial application assessment, slow authorization, lack of flexibility in the regulation for the approval process, the functioning of CTIS, which is a clinical trial database, the knowledge of the sponsor on how CTIS work and how can we support them. So all of this requires a lot of simplification across Europe and a lot of improvement with concrete actions that can be taken up by the different players. Another big problem was the framework for funding clinical trial during emergency in the EU. There was identified that there is insufficient coordination for conducting trial and fragmentation of trials, like I said, but also there is no consolidate mechanism in Europe for prioritizing which medicine needs to be investigated, and also how to then allocate funds in a flexible way, so that's and you know, scientifically driven way, so that trials can be conducted rapidly, but also taking altogether different member states. So far, mobilization of funds is defined as low and uncertain, looking at what happens during COVID. So a lot of solution, like I said, has been discussed and agreed and put in the report. It's important that the funding mechanism is efficient and predictable, so that sponsors know what to do and how can get money. And also it's important to define which products should be researched as a priority and should get then money as a priority immediately. So for this, the idea was to create a coordinating committee with a transparent process. But and this should also work during preparedness. And then to create a network of pre-qualified clinical trial sites to have as much as possible documents standardized. For example, contract templates should be standardized as much as possible and then just updated and then used without negotiation by the different member states to cut down times, which is especially important during the pandemic. And if we go to the next slide, which is also my last one, the focus of all these activities is to make EU more attractive for investigational clinical research. This is critical during crisis, but is important for preparatory work right now in preparedness. There are a number of actions, and here I try to list some. For example, in January 2022, the Commission, heads of medicines agencies, and EMA launched the clinical trial initiative to accelerate clinical trial in Europe, ACT EU, same scope. Vaccelerate, for example, another example of a project publicly funded in 2021 to create a network of clinical trials for vaccines specifically, to rapidly react in an emergency, but also during preparedness to answer public health relevant questions on vaccines. There are a number of initiatives on therapeutics like REMAP-CAP, EU Response, SolidAct. The ideal action at this point is to gather all these efforts, synergize initiatives with the scope facilitating trial in the EU, and the actors that participated, the stakeholders that participated at the workshop at EMA in June are working on this. For example, the action on the regulatory part that proposed at that workshop will be developed under ACT EU, so that we can have a liaison with for all the other medicines and stakeholders. The financial legal part will be taken up by the various European bodies and the Commission. And the idea is to build on the existing networks and lessons learned, for example, building of Accelerate and other initiatives, so that we don't start from scratch, but we can continue to improve all the work and money that has been put in all of these initiatives. And I think that was my last slide. Thank you for much for your attention.